Imagine a world where the sun rises over a silent, frozen city. There are no merchants shouting their prices in the crowded market squares, no children playing in the alleyways, and no church bells ringing for the morning prayer. Instead, the only sound you hear is the rhythmic, haunting creak of a heavy wooden cart's wheels hitting the uneven cobblestones. A lone man, his face wrapped in a dirty cloth, cries out into the thick morning mist, "Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!" This is not a scene from a modern Hollywood horror production. This was the terrifying daily reality of Europe in the year 1347. The nightmare began with 12 ships. 12 Genoese trading vessels that had spent months traveling the Silk Road trade routes. In October 1347, they crawled into the Sicilian port of Messina. But these weren't ships of commerce bringing spices, silks, and gold. They were floating graveyards. When the curious locals rushed to the docks to greet the sailors, they were met with a sight so gruesome it would haunt the collective memory of humanity for centuries. Most of the crew were already rotting corpses, slumped over the oars or tangled in the rigging. The few who were still clinging to life were delirious with pain. Their skin was covered in mysterious, grape-sized black boils that oozed thick blood and foul-smelling pus. These were the Bubos, the calling card of a killer we now know as the Black Death. Within mere days, the plague moved like a wildfire from the docks into the narrow, filthy streets of Messina. It didn't care about your status. It struck kings in their stone castles and peasants in their mud huts with equal ferocity. It was a silent, invisible executioner that was about to bring the most powerful continent on Earth to its knees. In the next 15 minutes, we're going deep into the belly of this medieval apocalypse. We'll explore the terrifying science of the infection, the bizarre bird mask doctors who tried to stop it, and the total social collapse that almost wiped the human race off the map. This is the ultimate story of the Great Mortality. To understand the terror, we have to understand the enemy. In the 14th century, people lived in total scientific darkness. They had no concept of a germ or a virus. To the medieval mind, the plague was caused by the evil eye, the wrath of a vengeful god, a bad alignment of the planets, or the mysterious miasma, a theory that poisonous air was rising from the earth to choke the living. But the real killer was far smaller, far more calculated, and far more deadly. The real culprit was a microscopic bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This biological assassin was a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. It didn't travel on its own. It had a highly sophisticated two-stage transport system. The first stage was the gut of a flea. The second stage was the body of a black rat. In medieval Europe, hygiene was a luxury that simply didn't exist. People lived in cramped quarters, and trash and raw sewage were routinely thrown into the middle of the streets. Rats loved this environment. They lived in the thatched roofs of houses, the holds of every merchant ship, and the massive granaries of every town. When a rat infected with the plague eventually died, the fleas living in its fur would lose their food source. Desperate for a new host, these fleas would jump to the nearest warm-blooded creature, which in a crowded medieval city was almost always a human being. Once a flea bit a human, it would vomit the Yersinia pestis bacteria directly into the person's bloodstream. Within 3 days, the biological clock began to tick. You would wake up with a high fever, agonizing muscle aches, and a headache that felt like your skull was splitting open. Then came the Bubos, the swelling of the lymph nodes in the groin, neck, or armpits. These swellings would turn hard, purple, and eventually a deep, necrotic black. If the Bubos burst, you had a small chance of survival. If they didn't, the bacteria would multiply until your internal organs failed and your skin turned black with gangrene, giving the disease its chilling name, the Black Death. But even scarier was the mnemonic version. If the bacteria reached your lungs, it became airborne. Every cough, every breath, and every word spoken by an infected person turned the very air into a weapon. In this form, the death rate was a staggering 100%. No one survived. As the plague swept through the heart of Italy, moved into the vineyards of France, and eventually crossed the Channel into England, the very fabric of society began to tear apart. Fear is a powerful poison, and the Black Death turned every man against his neighbor. Imagine the psychological trauma of seeing your entire family die within 48 hours. People had no idea how the disease spread, so they turned to the only thing they knew: isolation and abandonment. The famous Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio recorded the horrors in Florence, describing how brother abandoned brother, and even fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children as though they did not belong to them. This wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a moral and spiritual collapse. The church, the bedrock of medieval life, was powerless. Priests died in such high numbers that there was no one left to give the last rites to the dying. In many cities, the dead were simply piled up in the streets because the graveyards were full within the first week. This desperation led to two extreme and bizarre reactions. On one side of the spectrum, you had the flagellants. These were wandering bands of men who believed the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of humanity. They traveled from town to town, half-naked, whipping their own backs with iron-tipped leather lashes until they bled, chanting for mercy. They thought that by punishing themselves, they could satisfy God's anger and stop the dying. On the opposite side, you had people who realized that death was coming regardless of their actions. This led to a wave of nihilism and hedonism. People took over abandoned mansions, drank the finest wines from empty cellars, and engaged in massive, days-long parties. They figured if the world was ending, they might as well go out in a blaze of indulgence. Meanwhile, the economy simply vanished. Fields of wheat were left to rot in the sun, and thousands of sheep and cows wandered aimlessly through the woods with no one to tend them. The price of food exploded, and for the first time in human history, having a pile of gold meant nothing if there was no bread to buy. If you walk through a museum today, one image stands out as a symbol of this era: the plague doctor. With their long, heavy leather robes, wide-brimmed hats, and those iconic bird-like beak masks, they looked like terrifying monsters from a nightmare. But in reality, these were the frontline workers of the 14th century. They weren't trying to be scary. They were trying to survive what they thought was a miasma, or bad air. The long beak of the mask was actually a primitive respirator. It was stuffed with a mixture of over 55 different aromatic herbs, including dried roses, lavender, mint, cloves, and camphor. The doctors believed that the scent of death was the disease itself, so if they could only smell the flowers, they would be safe. They also carried long wooden canes, which they used to examine patients without actually touching them, or to push away the desperate crowds of people begging for help in the streets. Unfortunately, their medical treatments were often as deadly as the disease. Following the ancient Greek theories of the four humors, they believed the body was out of balance. Their solution? Bloodletting. They would cut open a patient's veins or apply leeches to drain the infected blood, which only served to weaken the patient further. Other cures were even more insane. Some doctors suggested pressing a plucked, live chicken against the buboes to draw out the poison. Others recommended drinking crushed emeralds or even human urine. While the medical world was failing, the plague was inadvertently destroying the feudal system. Before 1347, Europe was a land of lords and serfs. Peasants were basically slaves tied to the land. But the plague changed the math. When nearly 50% of the workforce died, the survivors suddenly realized they were in high demand. Lords were desperate for someone to farm their land. For the first time, peasants could demand higher wages, better living conditions, and the freedom to move. This labor shortage was the spark that eventually ignited the end of the Middle Ages and paved the way for the rise of a middle class and the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. By the time the first great wave of the Black Death finally subsided in 1353, the world was an unrecognizable shell of its former self. Europe had lost an estimated 50 million people. To put that in perspective, that is half of the entire known population of the continent. It took nearly 200 years for the human population to return to the levels it had reached before the ships arrived in Messina. But the bacteria never truly left us. Yersinia pestis broke out again every decade for the next few centuries, most famously during the Great Plague of London in 1665. As we stand here in 2026, we have to look back and ask, is it really over? The chilling truth is that the plague still exists. It is found in rodents in the American Southwest, in parts of Africa, and across Central Asia. However, humanity finally has a weapon the medieval world could only dream of: antibiotics. If caught in time, a disease that once ended civilizations can now be cured with a simple course of pills. The legacy of the Black Death isn't just one of death and darkness. It is a story of human resilience. It forced us to innovate, leading to the birth of modern public health, the creation of hospitals, and a shift in focus from superstition to observation and science. It remains the darkest chapter in the human diary, a grim, eternal reminder that we share this planet with microscopic forces we are only just beginning to truly understand. If you found this deep dive into the shadows of our past fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to EduFacts TV. We want to hear from you. If you lived in the year 1348, what would have been your strategy for survival? Would you have stayed in the city or fled to the mountains? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep learning.